All right, hi everyone. Welcome to the Canadian Meteorological and Oceanographic Society's lecture series for Manitoba. There will be time at the end for a few questions at the end of the talk. If you do have a question, it's preferred that you use the chat window. Today's talk is by Scott Kehler. He's the president and chief scientist of Weatherlogics here in Winnipeg. And his topic today is the private sector meteorology in Canada. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Scott.
Thanks, Pat, and it's great for everyone to join us today for their presentation. For my talk today, I've got a few things that I'd like to share with you. The three main things I'll be going through are the private sector market, the technology that the private sector uses, and lastly, the future of what this sector may look like. So starting out with the market, I thought I'd just define the weather enterprise. We've all heard of it, but some people have provided a definition, and one that's been used in AMS Journal is the totality of activities by individuals and organizations to enable weather information to be created and provided to society. So this can include everything from government agencies to our federal government, I should say, provincial government, private companies, universities, and others. So there's a wide range of different groups that would fall into the weather enterprise, and we all contribute in different ways. In terms of the private sector market itself, we don't have great estimates on how large it is. There have been some studies over the years trying to figure out what the total value is. Some of the more recent, although at this point not really that recent anymore, studies suggested that in the US, it was $4 to $5 billion in 2012. In Canada, the most recent study I could find was about 20 years ago, and it was actually a study I think that CMOS was heavily involved in. And at that time in 2001, they said 55 to 65 million. More recently, the National Weather Service commissioned a report which looked at the state of the weather enterprise, mainly in the US. And in their study, they suggested that the annual growth rate of the private sector was 10 to 15%. So what I did is took those older figures and applied the growth rates. So using that this year, we would expect the US to have a market of roughly 10 to 13 billion, and in Canada, about 407 to 481 million. I think those are fairly reasonable numbers, but again, the actual figures are still a bit uncertain. We don't have the best data collected because it's as far as the economy goes, it's still a fairly small sector, so it's not monitored as closely as many of the larger sectors. So in terms of the private sector's work in meteorology, here are some of the main areas that we tend to work in. I'll go through each one in a bit more detail, and I certainly won't be covering everything. There's many different areas, but I think this is a decent generalization of maybe 6 buckets you could put it in. So firstly, agriculture. This is one that I tend to work a lot in and my company works in. So I'm quite familiar with what's going on here. And I think the main thing that is important to note with agriculture right now is the transition toward precision agriculture. And precision agriculture is really an exploding market, both in Canada and around the world. And it has to do with essentially, I think, to put it simply, using technology to better produce crops. But a little more specifically, it's using everything from weather data to satellites to GPS and all sorts of other high-tech means to make growing crops more efficient. So you'll see on the images on the side, I think these are satellite images taking of things like NDVI or other indices that can monitor crop growth. And the satellites in the private sector are so detailed now, you can get down to a few meter resolution and allow farmers to know what parts of their field they should be targeting with certain treatments. And weather plays a big role in this because you need to know things like soil moisture and also what's the outlook coming up. So are we expecting more moisture, which could help our crops, especially in a place like the prairies the last few years where drought has been a concern. And many precision agriculture solutions are accompanied by on-field weather stations, which feed data back to the core technology that drives a lot of how this works. So there's many agribusinesses that are getting into this field, and many of them incorporate weather aspects into them. A lot of the precision ag companies don't have their own meteorologists. Some do, but a lot of their data is coming from the private sector to provide forecasts to farmers. So here's an example of something that we do specifically around agriculture, which is using weather forecasts to help farmers decide when to spray. So for a farmer, the main factor, of course, would be wind speed, but inversion strength is something that's also important for spraying. If there's strong inversions in place near the surface, that can cause spray to drift because it's not able to go into the crop. It tends to float off the field. And inversion strength is not a type of forecast that you would typically find on a weather app or anything like that. So this is a good example of a specific application where the private sector would take weather data and transform it into something actionable by farmers. Disease modeling is also another area where data is transformed, so we can use historical and forecast weather information to predict certain crop diseases, which are driven by certain weather conditions. Another sector that's requiring a lot of weather data is insurance. In Canada, especially in the past number of years, hail has been a big issue. So in places like Calgary, we've seen devastating hailstorms in 2020, which is where this map is from. We had a massive storm in the northeast of Calgary, producing hail of up to baseball size, being driven by wind as well, producing over $1 billion in damage. So this type of hail map produced using weather radar algorithms helps insurance companies identify where hail occurred, how much of a loss they can expect, and also detecting fraud. So if somebody down here claimed that they were impacted by the storm, the insurance company could quickly see that was false and deny a claim, but they can focus in on the area where damage was actually happening. Similar types of maps can be produced for wind and rain. So flooding is another major peril that insurers are very worried about. So they'll take similar types of mapping to identify where flooding is a risk and also where it's happened or happening. In insurance as well, real data is important. So in Canada, we don't have the type of public severe weather database that the Storm Prediction Center has. So companies like Weatherlogics, well, in this case, actually uniquely to Weatherlogics, we maintain a database of hail reports so that we can verify that our radar maps of hail are accurate by overlaying actual ground measurements of hail with what radar has detected. So this type of work, which is necessary for that type of validation, is actually being taken up by the private sector. And in the area of tornadoes, we see people like the Northern Tornadoes Project aggregating a lot of tornado data for that peril. So different groups are aggregating these data sets that are needed in industry. Here's an example of combining hail reports with insurance data. So the insurance companies collect data on where claims have happened. So where has damage occurred? In this case, the map is showing using colors which fields have been impacted by hail over the course of a growing season. So we're able to take the claims data, which isn't a direct measurement of hail, but it does tell us where hail happened and kind of serves as a proxy for hail events. And we can combine that with actual hail data, be it from ground measurements or indirectly measured hail from radar, and create mapping so that they can understand where hail is happening on a broader scale. A lot of governments are purchasing weather data from the private sector as well. In fact, this is probably one of the larger parts of the private sector that's serviced by Canadian companies. So most large cities in Canada are receiving road weather forecasts from private companies. There's a number of private companies that offer this service. So what they'll do is take data from a road weather information system, which looks like this. If you watch carefully on the highway, you'll see these. In many parts of the country, almost every province has them. And what happens is this tower is measuring typical weather data like wind speeds, temperatures, even things like visibility and precipitation type. And then what happens as well is there's usually either a wire buried under the ground that goes to the road, and in the middle of the road, there's a sensor embedded in the pavement, which measures the temperature of the pavement. Or more commonly in the last few years, people are installing what look like cameras on poles or bridges. And these cameras have passive sensors, which can measure the road surface condition indirectly, so they don't have to actually try to bury it in the pavement. So these types of instruments are used very widely across Canada. The private sector will take the data from them, return the data to the government agency, and also use that data to produce future forecasts of how that road will evolve over time based on changing weather forecast conditions. So they'll forecast road temperatures and road condition, which is critical for highway maintenance and street maintenance, because salt effectiveness varies by temperature. So governments don't want to be wasting resources like salt when it isn't going to work. If it's too cold, salt will no longer melt the snow. So they'll closely monitor that to help make their maintenance more efficient. So this type of technology would be used by almost every province and almost every major city in Canada as well. Fire weather is another area. Forest fire specifically is what I'm talking about here, is managed by the provinces. So most provinces will have some type of a meteorological team in-house. Might just be people looking at weather data, or some provinces have their own meteorologists who are monitoring fire weather. And then other provinces that have smaller teams will contract out some of their fire weather forecasting to the private sector. And lastly, electrical utilities, crown corporations like Manitoba Hydro, Hydro-Quebec, BC Hydro will receive weather forecasts to help with all sorts of things. And this is not an exhaustive list. There's definitely other government uses for private sector data, but those are some of the more common. Marine is one as well. I'm in Winnipeg, so obviously we do not have much in the way of marine forecasting, except for maybe our lakes. But I know on the coast, especially the Atlantic coast, there's a lot of work in the private sector forecasting for marine, be it shipping or offshore drilling, all sorts of things like that. So I don't really have a whole lot to add because I'm really not experienced in that, but it's something that definitely is happening. Transportation is another important one. So private companies are providing road forecasts to trucking companies. Railways as well are receiving weather information because at certain cold temperatures, let's say -30, trains have to be shortened because the braking is less effective. So railways need to know what weather is happening so that they can plan accordingly. Airlines as well are oftentimes either having their own meteorologists in-house or receiving services from the private sector, often a combination of both, to help with their planning and ensuring safety. So the maps you're seeing here are road forecasts, showing road condition forecasts and temperature forecasts for the major highways across North America, which trucking companies would monitor, especially to help make sure that their drivers aren't encountering bad weather, and if they do, making sure that they stop before they get into a dangerous situation. Lastly, consulting. So this is basically just special projects. All sorts of things come up, anything under the sun. Some examples of what I've done in the past: I've developed special programs for weather modeling for different agencies. I've done air quality studies. I've done hail climatology. So there's all manner of things. These are very custom, though, often research driven, and also climate change related projects are of great interest these days as well. So how will climate change over time, and how should governments plan for that? And then this is just kind of a catch-all here. So there's all sorts of other things, many that I've missed, but many of our television and radio stations have meteorologists receiving data from private companies. APIs are kind of the data feed that powers apps. So if you have a weather app, it may or may not actually be generating the data itself. It probably is getting data from another company and just using it in its app. And then major outdoor events too are increasingly using private meteorologists to forecast for safety reasons. So as an example, last summer, I was involved with forecasting for a fireworks event in Calgary, because if you're shooting fireworks, weather is a big concern. And also, if you've got a crowd, you want to make sure that they stay safe. So now moving on to technology, what I've done here is kind of outline generally the flow of information through the technology that's being used. This applies, I would say, more or less to any type of meteorological team, but I've kind of tailored it a little bit more to how most private companies would see it. So what happens is we receive raw data. It could be satellites, radars, weather stations, models. Now, models, I note, are not really raw data, but for this purpose, I'll just kind of treat them as such. And then that raw data is processed, so it could be aggregated into different things, could be turned into statistics, could be calibrated to ensure its accuracy. All sorts of things go on, quality control. Then from there, depending on the scenario, sometimes the data that's processed will go straight into products. So whether it's maps or charts or it could be all manner of different things. But depending on how the company or organization works, the data may go through meteorologists first and then get turned into products. So we see in some private companies, meteorologists play very little role in terms of adjusting or making day-to-day weather forecasts. They'll spend more time consulting or issuing alerts. Other organizations will have meteorologists heavily involved in forecasting. And I'll talk a little later about how that's evolving, but I say sometimes because meteorologists are no longer essential to the process because our computer modeling can produce satisfactory data in many cases. So once the products are created, they go to delivery. And so now with modern technology, there's so many ways of delivering weather forecast apps, emails, websites, traditional media, newspapers. So the delivery options are increasingly endless. So what does raw data look like? Well, I'm looking at this kind of from the private sector perspective because historically raw data was basically the domain of government. They would operate the weather stations, the satellites, the radars, upper air stations, and so on. But these days, the private sector's capabilities in gathering raw data are immense. Here's one example. I'm showing the Farmers Edge network of weather stations from a tweet that was published a couple of years ago. So presumably this network's even bigger now. But every dot is a weather station that they manage or own. So you can see there's huge number on the prairies, and it's growing. They don't just work on the prairies either; they're all over the U.S. and other parts of the world. So in this area of the prairies, I would guess the federal government maybe has, if I was generous, 200 weather stations, but likely less than that. But you can see here, Farmers Edge has many, many hundreds more than that. And they're just one group. There's many other agribusinesses that have them as well. Private sector has lightning detection. It has their own modeling now. It also even is launching its own satellites. So we're seeing more and more private companies trying to sell satellite data. So the private sector capabilities are every year getting closer and closer to being comprehensive in terms of what they can offer. Now next, the processing portion. So in my opinion, taking raw data and turning it directly into products is generally poor practice. You don't want to take, let's say, a raw model output and just assume it's correct and turn it into a forecast. What you want to do is either have a meteorologist look at it first or run it through some type of statistical calibration. Same with weather observations. They really need to be quality controlled before they're used for anything important. So this processing is a really important step that's often overlooked. And in terms of the private sector, a lot of the larger companies have very sophisticated systems for turning model output or other observations into forecasts. And the approach, particularly for turning model data into forecasts, is often called a super ensemble approach, where they'll take a bunch of models, calibrate them, and turn them into a forecast. So what I'll briefly show is the national blend of models, which is the NWS or NSEP version of that approach. So the national blend of models is a relatively new thing. What they do is take every available weather model they can get their hands on. Here's a list of them. There may even be more on the list now because I don't know if this is the latest version. But they take every model, they apply a bunch of different statistical methods to it, and then produce what they believe to be the most skillful forecast possible from that data. So they call it a highly accurate, skillful, and consistent starting point. for gridded forecasts. So they encourage their meteorologists to start with this national blend when they're producing their forecasts, so that everyone's kind of starting on the same page, and they're starting from what's already a very good product. So a thing like the national blend is incredibly impressive in terms of its performance. I won't go through every result in the table, but this is research published in an AMS journal, or I think it's AMS anyway, a journal. So I've highlighted this one column. This is if you compare the national blend against the high resolution analysis across the US. Everywhere it's green is where the national blend, so basically this model, outperforms their meteorologist forecasts. So it either is the same or outperforms in every category, including precipitation. If you compare the national blend forecast against meteorologist forecasts just at METAR, so just at airports, there's a little bit more competition, but that's because the meteorologists are probably watching the observations at airports very closely to help make their forecasts. But we know that airports weather stations are sporadic, so all the gaps in between those airports, the national blend is outperforming, and in some cases by a lot. So in the case where it's much better, the brighter green, that's more than 10% better than the NDFD, which is their meteorologist grid of forecasts. So it's very impressive, already showing performance exceeding meteorologists, and this was from 3 or 4 years ago, and it's continued to improve. This is how the NWS and many private companies make their forecasts using this system called the GFE, Graphical Forecast Editor. It's a gridded system where meteorologists can highlight an area and adjust the forecast on a grid wherever they choose to. So it's getting to be a more outdated tool. It's, I think, over 20 years old at this point, but it's still pretty widely used, because I would say it's the most accessible tool available for forecasting, and really one of the only, I guess, free ones out there as well. So many private companies, including us, use this, and the NWS still uses it as well. So now meteorologists, how's the role of a meteorologist changing? Well, it is definitely evolving. As I've shown, making forecasts is something that meteorologists are going to do less and less of, because the benefit of doing so is getting smaller and smaller. We see a lot of organizations now are only involving meteorologists in the short term. So let's say the next couple of days of forecasting. Long range is entirely model driven. And over time, that's going to shorten even more. So I wouldn't be surprised to see meteorologists getting withdrawn from even making tomorrow's forecast and not too distant future, because as you saw from that national blend, which was the day 1 to 3 forecast, I think it's already better in most cases anyway. And that's, like I said, an older version of their system. Nowcasting is probably an area where meteorologists will continue to be more involved, because it's harder to process data quickly enough to produce nowcasts automatically. But as computing power increases, that may also be a realm where meteorologists are removed over time, but that will be a lot longer, I think. And because of the evolution, communication for meteorologists is a much more important skill, being able to communicate clearly information to the public and to clients. Also, having a strong programming background, very crucial, because meteorologists will need to be able to develop the tools which produce automated forecasts with their knowledge. So we're seeing an explosion of Python, which is this graphic here in the community. Lastly, products. So I won't dwell on this too much. Just some examples of products, graphs, or maps that can be produced from weather data. And then, of course, delivery, all sorts of different means of delivery. Even tweets are very effective. Social media is a very effective way of delivering weather information. Apps are very effective. And then there's more traditional things like talking by phone or seeing something in a newspaper. So what does the future look like? Well, I've decided to kind of give my take on what I think the future should look like. And the first thing I'd like to see a lot more of is more collaboration between different parts of the weather enterprise, especially in Canada. We're seeing in the US a lot more collaboration, especially between public and private. But in Canada, I think we need to do way more of this. We need to do a lot more private sector advocacy, and I'll explain why in a moment. And some of the critical things that are needed are moving toward open sourcing all of the data that governments produce by default. Right now, international companies are taking advantage of our policy of charging for data. So American companies will buy data from our government and then resell it back to Canadians. Canadians should be getting the data for free, just like Americans get their data for free. And we should be able to use it to grow our economy. Developing a robust private sector also is very good for Canadian innovation and technology development. So we need to continue to foster that so that these companies are in Canada and not going to other countries where they've got more favorable policies. Also developing pipelines to commercialize our research. In the US, we see groups like NCAR have people who are working on commercializing weather research into products, and they've quite successfully done that in a number of areas. And unfortunately, in Canada, there seems to be a bit of a distrust between the public and private sectors. I think the public sector is nervous that private companies are going to take their jobs, and the private sector is frustrated that the government won't work with them. And really, this doesn't benefit anyone in the long run, because the private sector, as you've seen, is growing its capabilities by leaps and bounds and will continue to do so. So if they're not going to get help, they're just going to do it on their own. And this actually is a huge detriment to our government, because if the private companies are able to do everything themselves, there's no need for government support. So it's actually critical for government to remain relevant that they work closely with the private sector. Because if government embeds their data in private industry, the private industry will come to rely on it. So it'll be very difficult to remove any public sector activities. But if the public sector decides they're not going to collaborate, the private sector will do it on their own, and over time the public sector won't really have a role anymore. So it's actually in both parties' interest to work together to create an ecosystem where both rely on each other rather than one just doing everything independently. Another area that's really huge is machine learning. So using AI to take weather data and identify complex relationships. So if you think about yourself and how you might produce a forecast, you're taking in all sorts of different data, weighting it mentally in very complex ways and producing a forecast. Well, machine learning basically does that automatically, not as easily as humans do. It takes a lot of skill to develop machine learning models, but what they're able to detect in terms of patterns is very impressive. And weather data is very well suited to this problem because weather data is mostly numeric and already organized into grids, which machine learning can utilize very easily. And we're already seeing great successes in machine learning. This is actually from quite a while ago. This is a research study from 10 years ago, where they said, couldn't we take weather model forecast of precipitation, put it through machine learning and produce a good result? So there's 4 charts here. This one in the top corner is daily precipitation analysis. So how much precipitation occurred on this day. This is what you would get if you just averaged all of the weather models. So this is what an average weather model forecast would be, let's say from 8 different weather models. This is what the machine learning model produced from a forecast in terms of a forecast. So if the machine learning took those models in and created an output, this was the machine learning forecast. And then lastly, this was the human forecast from the Weather Prediction Center in the US. And you actually see the machine learning forecast and the Weather Prediction Center forecast are very similar. And in fact, when they verified their machine learning forecast, it actually edged out the humans by a bit of a margin. So if you compare the machine learning forecast to the analysis and the human forecast to the analysis, you'll see the machine learning, while not massively better in this case, does have some areas where you can identify it improving on the humans. So this was from 10 years ago, and things have gotten even better. So the fact that machine learning could beat humans 10 years ago shows incredible potential with more computing power and better techniques. So lastly, future developments. I think that the private sector capabilities will continue to grow. Big part of this is cloud computing. So you can create an account with Amazon or Google, and within seconds have access to all the computing power you'd ever want, which is very, very novel and gives anyone the ability to run their own models or process data in ways that could never be done before. Remote sensing is something private sector is investing in and will continue to be a big capability that they're growing. Lastly, as I mentioned earlier, I think collaboration is very important, and we're seeing it in many other countries. In the US, NOAA has released tons of data in their big data project in the Google Cloud and Amazon Cloud. The Europeans have now started to release the European model freely. So you can now download a lot of their model grids at no cost, which has never happened before. NCEP is doing community modeling, which is great. And I'm saying Canada's got to really step up in this area because we're seeing other weather organizations in other countries doing a far more collaborative approach. We're also seeing foreign large international companies like IBM taking our business in Canada. And that's going to result in, over time, a brain drain and make both our private and public sectors far less important if we don't step up and really enhance our game. So that's what I had for my presentation today. I'll just leave this final slide up for questions if anyone's got any. And if you have anything else you'd like to discuss, feel free to get in touch.
Okay, Scott, that's fantastic. Actually, if I can, you're currently the host right now. I wonder if
Want me to give it back?
You could, or you could just turn off the mutes for everybody, because there's a smaller group, so people can ask questions directly rather than through the chat.
Okay. Let's see if I can do that. You want me to keep recording for now?
Well, here, yeah, I'm just going to see if I can undo some of these. Actually, Barry was able to undo his own, so that was good. So, so if people want to ask some questions, just unmute and you can ask your question.
Well, since I'm unmuted, I'm Barry Goodison. I happen to chair the Ottawa Centre, but I have a strong interest in the topic you were speaking about, and your comment about CMOS taking a more proactive role in pulling the private sector together in Canada and with the others, I think would be welcomed by the certainly the current president, Jim Abraham. But I think it is, and also one of the players who's been leading this the debate within CMOS has been Brian Day and Claude Levine of Campbell Scientific Canada, before it got taken over. And the whole private sector has a big role to play. So there are people out there who wish to do this, but I think this is something that really would be beneficial, and I'm glad you brought it up. But I had a couple of questions. One, you talked about rain in your opening one when you were saying applications. You talked about rain. You never mentioned snow at all in the ability to forecast it or the huge impact it has, whether it's agriculture, road maintenance, the huge mega millions involved in clearing driveways and so on. I wonder if you can comment on what you see as a role for private sector there.
Yeah, that one, I guess I didn't explicitly say, but probably the main area where that is being done is in the area of road maintenance. So the RWIS systems that are implemented by governments, they are monitoring road conditions. So if roads are becoming snow covered, so the weather stations themselves that are embedded in the pavement don't really measure snow directly, but they're used as part of the weather forecasts that the government would receive. So they would get a forecast from a company saying we're expecting, let's say, 5 centimeters of snow. Based on the road temperature, how will that snow actually affect the road? So will it melt, or will it turn to ice, that sort of thing? So that's a huge part of that whole government road maintenance area. And there's a lot of private snow clearing companies as well. It's more hit and miss in terms of what they're doing. I think a lot of them are frustrated by how difficult it is to forecast snow. So some of them are receiving forecasts from private meteorologists. Some are just relying on apps and things, but regardless, it's definitely one of the biggest sectors, especially when it comes to government road maintenance.
I'll let others say so. I've got a couple other questions, but if others have questions first, please go ahead. If not, I'll
Yeah, go ahead. Someone
there's
raised their
one.
hand,
Go ahead.
actually.
Yep.
Ashton, are you able to talk? It looks like you're unmuted.
Yes, I can talk. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question. Thanks to begin with, very interesting presentation, Scott.
Thank you.
I'm based out here in Regina, and I work with the federal government, the Department of Agriculture. I just wanted to ask a question on, I guess, investments by the private sector in the actual measurement of weather variables. You showed a map of, for example, of farmers' age, lots of stations in southern part of the prairies. I've looked at that, and I noticed actually that most of those stations are seasonal, mostly because they are serving agriculture during the frost-free period. So they don't actually, they look like they are lots, but essentially they cater for a very short period. But we know for a fact that really, just like Barry was saying, what goes on in winter has got a lot of influence on what happens later on. So snow measurement is not, for example, captured by those stations. And even beyond that, we have the north, which is pretty much empty. And what goes on up north affects what's going on in the southern parts of the prairies. So what is the role of really the private sector? I notice most of what the private sector is collecting in terms of observations is mostly in the settled south, where they can get money. But we know that for matters of safety, security, we need more than just what's happening in the south. So what's your role in investing in not necessarily your company, but shouldn't the private sector be investing in the collection of weather data?
Well, I think this is
Sorry
a
for the
great.
long-winded question.
No problem. I think this is a great example of where collaboration is needed, because the governments are in the business of doing things in the public interest, while private companies need to make a profit at some point because that's the only way they exist. So if we had better collaboration, what would make sense is for private companies and even provincial governments to be doing more of the investments in the south where there's ability to make profit. And then the federal government can focus more on those more rural and remote areas where there's not as much of a profit available because there's just not the population. So we can cover different parts of the country and therefore get a complete picture through our joint efforts. Because you probably won't see private companies investing in the north simply because there aren't the people to support a business there. So if the federal government were focusing there and we were focusing in the south, we could combine our resources and do a much better job. Anyone, any other questions, or
if I
I'll
may,
go to Barry?
this is the whole thing about, let's call it data. Be all the way from collection through the quality control, archiving, and making it accessible rather than just a throwaway observation. To me is critical, because one thing, even in the points that were just brought up, are really important and need discussion. Because I started in hydrometeorology, did a lot of work on the prairies and satellite work and ground measurements, and ended up at the World Meteorological Organization for a bit. And my wife is here, who is a meteorologist as well. And she worked at WMO over 3 decades in various programs in climate. And the thing is that when networks were developed, and I can say this from being in Government of Canada, they recognized there were multiple purposes, but as time went on, they said their primary purpose was the forecast and aviation. They will try and tell you that isn't, but it was. But for all of to understand the questions of the day in climate and even applications in whether it's what you're doing in extreme weather and so on, you need those data, and they have to be preserved. That was not a priority. Even station histories are not online yet they're supposed to be. So there's a big gap. And unfortunately, it costs money. And when you come to prioritize where do you spend your resources, it doesn't always come out as top of mind. But I think it's something that with collaboration, private sector, governments at all levels, there could be a lot more data made available, shared, but it has to be done collectively. And that's a huge challenge. I think that's something to keep in mind, but I'd appreciate your view on the sharing of data that the private sector collects. It's one thing to criticize government, but, and then that gets into the issues of standardization and quality control from the private sector. What is your view on sharing of those private sector data?
Well, I think that you would find most private sector companies are willing to share data as long as other people aren't using it against them. So if I'm sharing my data in a way that my competitors are using it against me, that could be a problem. But I wouldn't have an issue sharing data with government agencies or nonprofits who need it to study things in the public interest. So I think that's probably where you would find some pushback from the private companies. They don't just want to totally open source and give their competitors everything that they've paid for, but they're very willing to collaborate with people who aren't working for profit to help us better monitor our environment.
Okay, good.
Any other questions?
I guess a general one is, from your perspective, you mentioned about CMOS could take a role, and have you given any thought on how that could evolve, or should it be made a special project within CMOS National, or how might is given that any consideration?
Yeah, I've given a little bit of thought. I think that well, we have a private sector committee, and I haven't been in it before, so I don't know what they're doing right now. But the idea of making it more of a priority, I think, is very important. So if that's through a special project, or whether it's through making that committee more active, something in that regard. And I've got my own ideas of what we should do, but if we can bring together the other private sector groups, I think the first thing is, establish the list of priorities. What would we like to see done? And then actually go out and do it. And it sounds like from what you were saying, there's others who are enthusiastic about that. So if it doesn't have to be a huge group. If there's a small group of us that are enthusiastic enough, we'll get things done. So that's probably where I would start with. We'll just have to find what are the main common priorities, start with that, and then hopefully we'll get some momentum and keep improving things from there.
Okay, thank you.
It's Pat. Actually, following up on that question, I remember I used to always promote when I was in the weather service. We were always hosting, congresses or conferences or workshops that were all from the perspective of the meteorologist. And I always proposed that we actually have, say once every 3 years, host a client congress or client conference or whatever. And the idea of bringing them in, and they could share their frustrations, share their interests, share all these really neat things and opportunities that companies, but at the same time, it would enlighten, say, other people. It could be whether it's the government, because the government tends not to have a clue as to what the client is. It's just, they produce something, it goes out, and and I remember during our short time we were doing commercial services in the weather service for the 2 or 3 years we did that, and I was involved with that quite heavily. It was so enlightening and satisfying to give information directly to people where they were making a difference, and a lot of those people were commercial people. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity there to do that. Maybe something CMOS might want to look at someday. We used to have the meteorological, what would they call it? It was operational meteorology conference. We had them every 2 or 3 years. You could have the same thing. CMOS could maybe host a commercial one. We do have commercial people showing up at our CMOS Congress now, but I don't think the focus is there. It's very heavily on science and those types of things.
I think that's a great idea, and my background is as a meteorologist, and when I started getting into the private sector, I had no idea what people wanted, and you learn so much about how your assumptions are wrong. And I guess a good example is when I started making products for clients, I thought, oh, I'll give them all this great information. I'll give them all these variables, temperature and snowfall and all this great stuff, and they'll find that so useful. But the reality is they don't want more data. They want things that they can take action on. They want to know what time is it going to start snowing, and is that snow going to melt or not. They don't want me to give them time series of temperature and precipitation and allow them to interpret that themselves. They want actionable details, and they want it as simple and as concise as possible. And I don't think that a lot of meteorologists especially don't get that, because we want as much data as we can get. The clients don't want as much data as they can get. They just want the key bullet points and what they need to get their job done. So learning from the client needs, I think, is really important, especially as we have the technological capabilities now to produce almost any data that people want. We need to know how to turn it into actionable products.
Yeah, that the issue of talking to the client is really important. I mean, I was fortunate when I started my career. When you work in hydrometeorology, it brings you with the water community. So most of my career, I was working, although I was working on snow, it was from a water point of view. And you're quite right, is they have a question that something that needs to be answered or addressed. How can you help them get to it? And I just wanted to add my experience in Europe. When you were mentioning about the Europeans and what they're doing, that has evolved immensely over the last decade. And a lot of it is because they've, one group you haven't mentioned, but they have a lot of programs that are government, private sector, and academia or research institutes. And it's actually, a lot of their private companies are also doing research and contributing. And I think that mixture has really allowed them to advance much faster than we have, because you're bringing the expertise, the knowledge, the needs together. And that's something I'd like to see promoted more here. And like everything, you sort of hit a bit of a brick wall when you start talking to people who want to preserve the status quo. And but I think that's an area. But your idea of the client-focused meeting, Pat, what is it? 2 years that you hosted in Winnipeg with UNBC or Northern British Columbia?
In a couple of years, yeah.
Perhaps that's one to say, hey, let's make it the focus and bring clients in, because the prairies is a perfect area to demonstrate so many of the different applications in particular, but also having British Columbia and unique stuff with the mountains. That could be a very interesting aspect, even if some of this, the block of time, even if it wasn't focused just on that, but it might be an appropriate venue.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I'll definitely share that with the other group. Okay, I guess that's it. All right. Thanks, Scott, for your very interesting talk. And this will be posted on our YouTube channel, probably the national one too, at some point. And so I'd like to thank everyone for your attendance. And again, if you're always interested in learning more about the Society, there's the CMOS website, but you can contact us through our email at cmoswinnipeg@gmail.com. And as Scott has on here, if you need more information from him, you can see his Twitter account and email. So once again, I really appreciate this. It was very, very interesting. Thanks a lot, everyone.